The podcast, everybody. We are joined by Joe Heschmeyer. Welcome to the show, Joe. Good to have you.
Thanks. It's good to be here.
Yeah, actually, good to have you back because we've had conversations before, at least one,
Yeah.
right? Yeah, on your last book, Pope Peter,
Yeah, that's right.
and it's good to have you back. And you have a new book out, and we're going to talk about the early church. Was it
Sounds good.
Catholic? Was it something else? And your new book is called "The Early Church Was the Catholic Church." So
I feel like that might give away my position.
There's the spoiler. We just ruined it.
Exactly.
It's done. Yeah, Joe, actually, I would actually like to start maybe on a more personal note. We've had some conversations here and there, but I don't know a whole lot about your background. Were you raised Catholic? Have you always been Catholic? Are you a convert? What's the story of Joe Heschmeyer?
So I'm raised Catholic, but I also claim a little bit of convert. By that, I mean, I grew up going to mass and not really understanding why the church taught what she taught.
Sure.
So I had some affiliation with the church. When I was about 12, I thought about leaving to become Lutheran because I didn't get the church's ecclesiology. I was like, why does the church make such a big deal of herself? Isn't she getting in the way of Jesus? And also, it seemed like the Protestant preaching I encountered was just a lot better than a lot of the Catholic preaching that I encountered.
Yeah.
And I was listening to a lot of Protestant radio as a family, without going way too far into the weeds. I just say this, my parents were trying to make sense of how to be good followers of Jesus Christ at an era that was not exactly a golden age of catechesis in the church.
Right.
And so we supplemented that with a lot of Protestant radio. This is before Catholic radio got big in Kansas City. I don't even know if there was a Catholic radio station in town at the time. But I think we were probably the only family on our block who both believed in the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist and was rapture ready, just in case Y2K turned out to be a big thing. So we had a weird hodgepodge of views, which meant that there was a lot of sorting out. Why do I believe what I believe? And what's the foundation for that? That really began in earnest in college.
Awesome. And you actually discerned the priesthood for a little bit, didn't you?
I did. So yeah, after college, I became a lawyer, and then I was in seminary for 5 years. And then I left and was with a group called School of Faith, doing faith formation and some evangelization and apologetic stuff with them. And now I work with Catholic Answers.
Yeah. Awesome. Okay. So a lot to discuss. And, let me throw this out there, Joe. I'll give a little bit of my story, and then you can tell me if I made a mistake.
Okay.
And maybe if I shouldn't have become Catholic or not. But for me, I mean, yes, it was an historical question. But for me, it was largely a philosophical consideration. And what I mean by that is, so I come from a sort of naturalistic background, and I got my way to theism and classical theism, very broadly considered. And I think once I sort of got my, once I got my sort of metaphysics and philosophical anthropology and epistemology right, it just seemed to me that with all those considerations, if God's going to reveal something, it's just going to look a lot like the Catholic faith, right? It just seems like authority and tradition are really important for epistemology. And especially if something's really important, like divine revelation, you'll need those mechanisms in place. It also just seems like the participation, right? Sort of metaphysics that I was, very attracted to, that's all over Catholicism, right? That makes sense. The sacramentality, we're physical beings. Again, I think there's kind of deep philosophical reasons of why, that's just the sort of thing I would expect, right? If from this philosophical paradigm. So I guess my thing was this, Joe. I thought, coming from a certain philosophical paradigm, what would I expect regarding divine revelation? Well, I guess I would expect something pretty much like the Catholic faith. And then you look at the historical details, and it seems like what you would expect is pretty much what's there, right?
Yeah.
And then for me, I didn't have to do a big historical, close off every possible alternative, right? To me, it was just sort of inference to the best explanation, almost kind of easy, done deal. You see what I'm saying?
Oh yeah, totally. So let me say back to you what I'm hearing or a version of it, and you can say, yeah, that tracks with what I was thinking or not.
Yeah.
You've got a few things going on there, it seems to me. One is what I call the logic of revelation. Revelation is the unveiling. And so when we're talking about divine revelation, we mean the unveiling of God, the unveiling of ultimate truth, ultimate reality. That you have on the one hand man's natural upward reaching out to God, the natural desire to see God. You see the, like the natural virtue of religion and all of that. So you have human beings left to their own devices are going to try to make sense of religious claims. But the distinctive thing about Judeo-Christianity is this downward reach that God reveals himself and gets us further than we could ever have gotten on our own through divine revelation, through grace, and so on. Catholicism is consistent with that in a way that Protestantism, for instance, isn't. Meaning, Catholicism still operates with this downward move. We've got this stuff that's revealed to us, and we can accept it and we can trust it. We don't have to figure it out by our own reasoning. Even if our reasoning supports it, great. If we don't know how to reason to that conclusion, we don't really sweat it. Whereas Protestantism, in as much as Protestants are trying to piece together orthodoxy from their read of scripture, there's still something of an upward motion. It's still very like man-centric rather than God-centric. So it seems like that's one trajectory.
Yes.
The other, and again, if this is just me going off in like a crazy tangent, please just say
no, go off. I'm enjoying it. Yeah, please continue.
There's a sort of pattern to the structures God creates. If you look at the family, like the role of headship in the family, or if you look at the whole history of salvation history from the patriarchs and the kings on down, even the judges, before the kings, you always have this kind of like there's somebody who is the final, the buck stops there, kind of final authority. Not that they decide ultimate truth, but that they're responsible for the implementation. The prophets, the kings, the judges, the patriarchs, and so on. And then you get to Catholicism, and the Catholic claim is, yeah, that's still true at the local level with the bishop, at the global level with the Pope. And it would be very remarkable if God actually wanted something like a democratic polity where, the people choose and it's actually bottom up, because he's never did bottom up. Democracy existed before the time of Christ, and he doesn't come and create the People's Republic of God. He creates the kingdom of God. So you have the same kind of top-down structure that you find in Catholicism in everything God creates, as far as I can tell. Like all of the kind of bottom up, more democratic, more like everyone's co-equal. We don't see that in creation. We don't see that in special revelation. It's much more just like a man-made thing than anything that appears to be divinely made.
Yes. Yeah. No, I love that, Joe. I think that's all spot on. Definitely similar to how I have been thinking about this and how I did think about it. I guess another way that I might want to put it is, it's just sort of basic hypothesis testing, right? Like if Catholicism is true, what sort of data should I expect historically, right? Versus if it's not true or something else is true. And my claim would be if Catholicism is true, I think I would expect pretty much what we see, right? If it's not true, then a lot of this data is really surprising. Right?
Yeah, it is very much so. I mean, like when we're looking at the early church, if Jesus and the apostles taught Protestant theology, isn't it weird that no one seems to have known that? Like, isn't it weird that we don't find early obvious, when you get to the church fathers, very broadly speaking, you're going to find fathers or sayings of the fathers that Protestants will say, oh, that could be interpreted either way because, it's not sufficiently specific to be obviously Catholic. And then there are other sayings that are just very obviously Catholic. Other fathers who are just very obvious, like they're more specific, they're clearer. And so you can't fit them into a Protestant context. If Jesus taught Protestantism, if the apostles taught Protestantism, it's just weird that you don't have people who are super obviously Methodist or Baptist or Calvinist or whatever, that you just don't see that, especially super early on. It's much easier to make sense of the fathers. It's much easier to make sense of all of the historical evidence from a Catholic viewpoint than from a Protestant one, if you actually dig into the history.
Right. And I think that's critical. That's how I wanted to open this up, because what's going to make the best sense of our total understanding of all the data, right?
Yeah. Exactly.
And I think that's key, right? Because for me, like, we can go back and forth on the specific details of any one particular father on any one particular issue. But when you zoom out and you look at our sort of total understanding, right? I don't know, man. Maybe I made a mistake, but to me, it just seemed like the Catholic paradigm was by far the best, right? In
Yeah.
terms of succession, authority, sacramentality, liturgy, language of sacrifice, like all this stuff fits really, really well in the Catholic hypothesis. And like, could you accommodate some of it on the rival hypotheses? Like sure, but a lot of it's going to be really strained, and some of it, yeah, I don't think fits at all. So I'm just trying to like situate the context and the sort of the greater conversation here, because I think it's so easy for people to just like zoom in on some hyper specific thing, right?
So,
and miss this larger point. You see what I'm saying?
Oh, totally. I'd say two things to that. One is on the specifics. Margaret Miles, who I quote in the book, points out that by the by the 3rd century, we know of hundreds of churches in North Africa for whom we have records. We don't have them for most of the broader church, but North Africa, we actually have a decent kind of paper trail for their list of bishops, and for like, we can tell you who the bishop was in these little towns in North Africa, hundreds of them. And so, just to take one example, if the structure of the church established by Christ wasn't that top-down structure, there wasn't supposed to be a bishop at top, and that was something that changed along the way, or local communities just kind of adapted to the circumstances, which are kind of the Protestant theories about it. Isn't it weird that that happened hundreds of times and that the end result all looked identical, like that they all opted for the same style? I mean, it'd be like if every country in the world suddenly instituted monarchy. It'd be like, what in the world happened? How would you explain that kind of historical phenomenon? And weirder still, if they did it and nobody left any written record explaining why this had suddenly happened. You know, every democracy scrapped their democracy and instituted a monarchy. That'd be really weird. We'd expect to see a lot of outcry. We get nothing of that. So in terms of the evidentiary tale, that's just like one piece of data. I mean, well, it's hundreds of pieces, but
Right.
that kind of thing, like, you just multiply that and you've got that all over the place with all of these different issues. So that's, I think, one thing. The second is maybe just very broadly on the level of framework. What is it? Structures of Scientific Revolutions, the book that gives us the phrase paradigm shift. It's this idea that when you're dealing with any kind of theory, there's always going to be the data that really fits neatly into the theory. And then there's going to be the stuff that's harder to make sense of. And this is true. Like, this is true of Catholicism. This is true of Protestantism. This is true of Orthodoxy.
Right.
This is true
There's tensions in every paradigm. 100%,
exactly.
right.
Exactly. And so we can own that as Catholics and say, yeah, there are going to be things that are harder to explain from a Catholic point of view, but they're just dwarfed by the things that are harder to explain if you adopt any competing kind of paradigm. And that's the debate to actually have. It's probably not going to be, I found this one obscure historical piece of evidence and therefore that settles the debate in either direction. It's going to be this overwhelming accumulation of evidence. And that's what I try to point to in the book, that we're not dealing with one or two fathers. We're dealing with a consensus before 200 that's very clearly pointing in a Catholic and not in any other direction.
Right. And you know, that's a really good and honest and important point, Joe, that all paradigms are going to have tensions. And let's just spend a minute on this, because I think it's important, right? When we're kind of like looking at different theories or worldviews or paradigms, right? A tension is just where it's some aspect of the paradigm where we don't really see how the parts fit together. Now, that doesn't mean we don't see that the parts do not fit together. That's a contradiction. We definitely want to stay away from that, right? Because those are sort of death blows, right? To any paradigm if we have an explicit contradiction, right? But you're right. All theories, all paradigms have tensions to a various degree. But I think we all agree that, hey, the fewer tensions, the better, right?
Yeah,
right?
And even true theories, like heliocentrism has tensions, where there's things that scientists have trouble explaining that you could maybe explain more easily, just those particular data points. You could explain more easily with some other theory, but it wouldn't be true on the whole. You'd realize, like, oh, even if it explains those 5 things, it leaves unexplained 1,000 other things.
Right. Yeah. And so for the Catholic paradigm, I think this is, of course, the Mutual Agreement podcast today. In terms of looking at the rival, alternatives of Christianity, I think we probably both say it's got the fewest tensions in relation to how much it explains really well, right?
Absolutely. And even when you see the tensions, they make sense in a certain way. Meaning, like, it's consistent with the Catholic claim that there are parts of theology that weren't immediately clear to everyone. So it's not shocking that you know, there are issues on which the church fathers are very much unanimously in agreement. And then there are issues that they're not in agreement, that there are issues that they're still sorting out. And neither of those things are kind of shocking given what the
Yeah.
Catholic claim would include.
Yeah. Now, maybe at some point we can do a conversation. Maybe we'll get to it later today, where we can kind of stress test the paradigm and take what we think are
Sure.
the greatest tensions. But let's focus. Let's now start to zoom in, because you've got this very, very nice book, and you are making the claim that the early church was the Catholic Church. So what is some of this data now, Joe? What is some of the data that is, let's say, unsurprising or fits really well with the Catholic paradigm, that creates various levels of tensions for anybody who wants to reject the Catholic paradigm? You pick our starting point, please.
Well, okay. I just maybe just the parameters. So in the book, I purposely aim at the first 200 years, and it's a soft deadline. I fudge it a little bit, but basically up to about the year 200. For the simple reason that when people suggest that Catholic teaching has changed, or you know that the teachings of Jesus aren't the teaching of the Catholic Church, if they have a historical claim, it's usually that like Constantine did something, or St. Augustine did something, or you know somebody in the 300s or 400s changed Catholic theology. And so if we're going back to the 100s and before, you solve for that, you know. So that's one of the things, kind of parameter wise. The second is I'm trying to find issues on which the church fathers are speaking both for a much broader consensus. Well, in other words, they're not trying to persuade their readers of a certain thing. They take it for granted that their readers already believe a certain
Right.
thing.
This is sort of the assumption, right?
Exactly. So the real presence and the sacrificial nature of the Mass, these are things that they can take as a litmus test for orthodoxy super early on. Or you know the necessity of bishops in the church, or the effects of baptism. These are all issues on which everybody is in agreement, who's within anything that we would remotely consider Christianity. Everybody's in agreement in a Catholic direction, and it is clear that the fathers are not just speaking for themselves. They're speaking both for a broader church, and they're often explicitly saying this is what they were taught by the apostles, or this is what was handed down by the students of the apostles. Like it's that kind of thing, where it's not like to contrast that. It's not this great theologian says, I think this is what this chapter and verse means, where that might be really good. That might be a brilliant insight, but that kind of thing is more susceptible to error, rather than this is what all of us heard from the apostles. That kind of thing we can give the same weight we give, you know, the eyewitness accounts of the resurrection, say.
Talk to us about living memory and why this is relevant here.
Yeah, I think it's Marcus Brockmule coins this term for the first 200 years. And to put it really concretely, living memory means when you're dealing with these guys in the late 100s, that sounds really far removed from the apostles, but you're actually dealing with people who learned Christianity from folks who learned Christianity from the apostles. So concretely, we know the apostle John dies around the year 100. He has a couple of disciples of whom we know, Ignatius of Antioch and St. Polycarp of Smyrna. Polycarp dies in 155. And he has two disciples of whom we know, Florinus, who ends up falling away from the faith and becomes a Gnostic, and St. Irenaeus of Lyon. So Irenaeus is an adult disciple of Polycarp. His great book Against Heresies, maybe the most important extra-biblical work from the first 200 years, is 180. And so 180 sounds like a long time. You know, it's 114 years after the death of St. Peter. But when you really drill down, and we're talking 80 years from the death of John, and we're talking about someone who, as an adult, learned, you know, from his infancy, from his childhood, learned Christianity from someone who got it from John, who, you know, had followed the Apostle John, you know, that sort of thing, where it's enough. You know, we have a letter from Irenaeus to Florinus, in which he just basically says, look, buddy, I'm paraphrasing, we both learned Christianity from Polycarp, and he didn't teach Gnosticism. That's what living memory looks like. He doesn't have to say, let's go read this text together and see what sense we can make of it, because they have a much more direct access to Christianity, because the people who were formed by the apostles were alive in their day.
Okay, so this is really helpful, Joe. I really appreciate that explanation. And there's two things I want to do at this point. One is I want to go back and look at some of the sort of assumptions that you put out there that do seem to fit really well with the Catholic paradigm. We talked about authority and succession. We talked about the sacramentality, the liturgy, and the sacrifice of the Mass. Like, okay, if those things are right there really early, well, that's sort of to be expected on the Catholic paradigm, not so much on the Protestant paradigm. However, I want to first talk about the sort of costs that would be associated with trying to explain away some of the data that might be inconvenient here, right? And you do some nice linking in the book of saying, look, if you're going to deny the reliability of these guys on these issues, then you're probably going to, undermine yourself on other things that you really care about as a Christian. Talk to us about some of that linkage, if you don't mind, because I think it's a really important thing to understand.
Yeah, one of the issues that I look at very particularly is, how do we know the Gospels are the right Gospels? How do we know Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are the four that we should have? And it's just to make it very clear, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John never announce who they are. We can kind of infer maybe that John wrote John, but they're all internally anonymous. So how do we know that they're of apostolic origin? How do we know that they're of first century origin? How do we know that these were like Orthodox people and not crazy heretics who had just invented their own version of what Jesus said? All of those questions lead us directly to the second century church. And I trace this in the book and in a chapter that specifically looks at these tests of apostolicity. Was it written by an apostle? At orthodoxy, does it match up with the spoken teaching of the apostles? At the early liturgical acceptance of these books, and at their use by the apostolic fathers, meaning the early church fathers right after the time of the apostles. And so all of those things are only answerable if you accept the authority of the second century Christians. If you think they're heretics, and you don't think you can trust them to get Christianity right in the main, which would be the logical conclusion on rejecting their view of the Eucharist, rejecting their worship, rejecting the structure of their church with bishops and everything, rejecting their view of baptism and how you're saved. Like, if you reject that they got all of those big things right, then they're not reliable witnesses. And that puts you in a really awkward spot, because the very first person that we have who mentions Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John by name is St. Irenaeus in 180, who we just mentioned. And he's coming at the tail end of this 200-year span. He's actually much later than someone like St. Ignatius. So I look particularly at this commentary on John by D.A. Carson. And Carson, in his beginning to the book of John, is looking at authorship, and he writes that even if Irenaeus, toward the end of the 2nd century, is among the strongest, totally unambiguous witnesses, his personal connection with Polycarp, who knew John, means the distance in terms of personal memories is not very great. Now, that's the living memory argument I made before. I think that's a good argument, except that then Carson goes on from there, and he's going to go ahead and argue that we can't trust we can't trust Ignatius, who was directly a student of John. He's going to say, the road from John to Polycarp to Irenaeus is still short enough that we can trust Irenaeus, but the road from John to Ignatius, who Irenaeus also agrees with and sides with, he's going to say that road is actually too big. He admits that Ignatius adopts a sacramentarian stance on the Eucharist in his commentary on John 6. Carson says this, and because Ignatius says things like that the Eucharist is the medicine of immortality. He talks about how those who don't confess the Eucharist be the flesh and blood of Christ, we can't be in communion with them. We can't have anything to do with them. He talks about it as a cleansing remedy to drive away evil and the rest. Like, he clearly thinks both the Eucharist is Jesus and the Eucharist does something. And from a Protestant perspective, both of those are controversial claims. And so Carson essentially says that, well, I'll just quote him. He says, well, if John was not a sacramentarian, how could so near a contemporary and presumably a disciple use such language? But he says the argument's not convincing, and here's why. He says, Ignatius betrays a number of shifts that take us beyond anything the New Testament says. For instance, he introduces us to monarchical bishops who oversee several churches, though there is no evidence of such an office in the New Testament. He insists that where the bishop is, there is the church. The New Testament writers would be unhappy with such a statement. And this and several other areas, Ignatius can be no sure guide to what John thought. Anyone who's followed theological developments in the 20th century, let alone the 16th or the 1st, does not need convincing that major changes can be introduced in the space of 20 years, even by disciples of a revered leader. So I want to just flesh that out. Ignatius is writing 7 years after the death of John. And according to Carson, in that span of time, it's possible that he's corrupted what John had to say about the Eucharist, about bishops, about the structure of the church, about all of these different things, that he isn't just introducing it to something new, but he's actually breaking away from what the New Testament said and saying things that the New Testament writers wouldn't have been happy with. In other words, he's teaching error and falsehood and even heresy.
It's a radical corruption.
That is a radical corruption in 7 years. And so if you're going to believe that, how in the world do you believe these people after that radical corruption set in still knew reliably which books belonged in the Gospels? On what basis? Like, if you say these are the people who corrupted Christianity and messed it up, well, you can't then turn around and look at them and say, and we can trust that they got the New Testament right, because why in the world do we trust that?
Right. Yeah. It's completely arbitrary, right? It's almost worse than that, in a sense that I think Carson, whether he intended or not, is making a very good argument for Catholicism here. And this is something that's always kind of subtle, but somebody who's really good at picking this out is Brian Cross, where what Carson is doing is he's already begging the question in favor of the Protestant paradigm, right? He's already begging the question in favor of his interpretation of Scripture. And like, you can't do that, right? Right? Like, that isn't sort of the neutral ground in which this debate is to be staged on. That isn't the neutral ground at all, right? He's already operating in his assessment from the Protestant paradigm. Do we see that? You see
totally.
That? The point I'm making?
I think, let me try to say it back and see if we're on the same page here. I'm thinking particularly about the fact that he's attacking Ignatius' view of the church. Now, the church isn't something that's primarily in somebody's head. The church is the living reality in which they live and breathe and move and operate, right? And so when Ignatius is describing the church as having 3 tiers of bishop and presbyters and deacons, he's not saying we should all adopt this. He's saying this is true. And so this is a guy writing shortly after the New Testament saying this is what the actual churches look like. Now, the New Testament doesn't say, here are the instructions to go build a church. Rather, the New Testament is written to already existing churches, And so rather than assuming that we got to start from, just a blank slate and reverse engineer and build a church based on what the passing references to church structure might suggest, the historically correct way is to say, okay, well, the church existed before the writings to the churches. What can we tell from those writings and from the other writings like Ignatius? What can we tell about the way that church actually looked? So in other words, like sola scriptura doesn't work because the church is already there. So I don't know if that's like the track you're on, but that's what immediately I was thinking of.
Yeah, no, that's good. And that's helpful. The reason I wanted to spend so much time at the beginning talking about sort of paradigmatic thinking and hypothesis testing is to understand that a lot of this debate, when it's made by Protestants, is already operating on the assumption of their paradigm, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And that's totally illicit, but that's something that so often just goes right underneath the surface. And I'm saying, guys, stop playing the game that way. That isn't how you make a fair assessment of the evidence, right?
Trying to reject a disciple of John on the basis of what you have from gospel texts that you only know from future followers of John is so backwards to say, well, we can just use the text against Ignatius of Antioch. Well, how do you get the text in the first place? Well, only because you can trust these 2nd century Christians. I mean, you're cutting off the branch upon which you sit. Once you say we can't trust the followers of John to preserve this stuff, okay, then you just don't have reliable access to the Gospel of John.
Right.
Like, you haven't left yourself with Protestantism. You've left yourself with something like agnosticism or maybe a vague theism, but you haven't left yourself with Christianity at all.
Right. Yeah. What you're doing there is you're really undermining the basis of any certainly mainstream Protestantism. I mean, maybe like what's available there. I mean, you have to think that like things maybe went off the rails immediately, and that now we just have this sort of epistemic fog that we can have no idea what the case was. Right.
I do a little bit of work looking at that, basically looking at secular scholars who aren't willing to accept the reliability of the 2nd century fathers, aren't willing to accept that the early communities are faithfully and honestly preserving what they're receiving and not just like inventing stuff. And one of the points I make is they get nowhere. Like this doesn't lead to some clear alternate vision of Christianity or of some other religion, it just leads to just a dead end. That there are 6 major camps that I look at within the scholarship that are in disagreement with one another and are going nowhere. That you just end up with 6 different Jesuses that look nothing like each other, that are totally contradictory to each other, and that not reliable, but like prominent scholars will point to. Like, these aren't fringe theories. Like, the academic field has just literally hit a wall because they don't trust their own evidence. I mean, it'd be like trying to do, history of Rome and just saying we're not going to trust any Roman sources. Well, you're not going to get very far. Like, that's not a good way to do scholarship. So
Right.
you don't end up with Protestantism. You don't end up with any kind of Christianity. You end up with just a muddle. You end up with a fog.
Yeah, that again is very helpful, Joe. I certainly don't hold myself as like the standard of rationality by any means, but I think, well, at least when it comes to Christianity, I can say that I was probably as close to an ideal agnostic as you can get in my initial assessment, right? Because I'm coming from an anti-religious background. And in fact, if anything, I had a bias towards Catholicism. When my wife and I were first kind of considering Christianity, I said, "Hey, look, I think there's more here than I originally considered. Maybe you'll want to consider it with me," right? Now, she grew up in an agnostic home in the South, and she had nothing but bad experience with Christianity. But one of the first things she said to me is like, "Look, okay, maybe I'll consider Christianity, but no way in hell am I becoming Catholic," right? So that was the position we were coming from. But when I, kind of looked at the various hypotheses and asked, well, what do they predict? What's the type of things that I might expect to see in the historical data? And then I actually, look at the historical data. To me, it just seems so obvious, right? It just seems so obvious. Now, obvious to an extent, because I think like there's at least an argument to be made that, okay, succession, sacramentality, liturgy, sacrifice, all that. So maybe Eastern Orthodoxy is still in the running or something like that, right?
Yeah.
But it does seem obvious to me that like the broad swath of much of Protestantism it's just untenable, right? And it was for me. I was never a Protestant because it just seemed untenable for not just historical reasons, but other many philosophical reasons as well. Am I exaggerating here, Joe? Am I missing something? Did I make a mistake? Help me if I did. You
The
can.
strongest forms of the Protestant claim just ignore history entirely.
Mhm.
Meaning, like, if you really want to be a serious Calvinist, you just say, well, here's what has to be true. God his will must work in this way. Our will can't be involved at all. And you just impose all these restrictions on God. And then you kind of follow logically kind of where that goes, where you say, man is totally depraved. And so therefore he can't contribute anything. So therefore we need limited atonement.
And not only that, but many of them are willing to just write off most of Christian history.
Well, exactly. That, you write off the first 75% of it. And so in this way, it really does work a lot like bad constitutional law. People who say, well, there's a constitutional right for abortion. They're not actually saying the founding fathers were really pro Planned Parenthood.
Right.
They're making a textual argument divorced from history.
Mm-hmm.
They're saying, even though that's not what the text meant at the time, we can reinterpret the words to mean this now. Mm-hmm. And that's the same thing Protestants are doing. They're not saying this is what the earliest Christians thought being born again in water and the Spirit means. They don't even look at that. They just ignore it. And they're saying, well, this is what we can make the text mean. This is what the text means to me. And that's just a bad way to do theology, a bad way to do scholarship, a bad way to do law. That's just not a good way to understand what a text means, to divorce it from what it meant to the original audience.
Yeah. You mentioned being born again. Very common phrase. Mm-hmm. You talk about it in the book. Yeah. How should we understand this, and why do you think this again is one of those pieces of evidence that favors the Catholic paradigm?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So everyone in the early church, and I'm not exaggerating here, everyone in the early church understood being born again of water and the Spirit to mean baptism. Mm-hmm. That when Jesus is talking to Nicodemus in John 3, nobody is interpreting that to mean Nicodemus needs to make a personal commitment to Jesus Christ in his heart. Mm-hmm. That view, the kind of non-denominational view popular here in the middle part of America now, like the people who call themselves born again Christian don't know what being born again means. As weird as that is to say, being born again is not you doing something for Jesus. It's God doing something for you in the sacraments, in the sacrament of baptism particularly. That's what's happening in being born again. And I quote Ferguson in the book, Everett Ferguson, who looks at 500 years of church history and concludes that there is a remarkable unanimity that not only does everyone believe, not just for the first 200 years, like I'm looking at the first 500 years, not only does everybody believe baptism actually saves you, but they're really consistent on the kinds of things baptism does. It infuses the Holy Spirit, it gets rid of original sin, it makes you a child of God, it incorporates you into the death and resurrection of Christ. These things are just all over the place. And a Baptist or a non-denominational Christian who says baptism is a symbol or baptism is something saved people do is at radical odds with the earliest Christians. Now, just to stress that point, when St. Paul is talking about basic doctrines, when he's contrasting milk and meat, he treats baptism as a basic one. Like baptism is something people get. There are harder doctrines people don't get. So the Baptist claim to be historically credible would have to say, here's this really basic doctrine that everybody got at the time of Paul, and yet 5 seconds after the death of Paul, nobody gets it. They all get the opposite. They're all united, but now they're all united in the wrong direction. And that's such a bad theory. Like that's just such a kind of a laughable version of history. It's like, look, we know what the early Christians believed about baptism because they've left us abundant evidence. And when the scriptural evidence suggests baptism is something they get, we should trust the early Christian view of baptism.
Yeah, I want you to give us one more here, Joe, that you would like people to be aware of that you think supports your case. And then if you're cool with it, we can take some questions from the audience, right? And of course, we're going to talk about this book because if you want the full case and the full details, you got to get it. It's a great book. So give us that. Give us one more.
Just one more doctrine or one more like related to baptism or a different one?
Let's do a different one,
okay,
if you don't
great.
mind. Yeah,
how about the sacrifice of the Mass? This one was eye-opening to me. I knew that the early Christians were very clear that the Eucharist was the body and blood of Jesus Christ, and we talked about that in terms of real presence. I actually think real presence can be a bit confusing because there are Protestants who don't believe the Eucharist is the body and blood of Christ, but will believe in like a Calvinist spiritual presence and still call that a real presence. But to be clear, the earliest Christians believed the Eucharist was Jesus, was the flesh and blood of Jesus. But they also believed, and this is the part I want to focus on, that in the Mass, they're offering the sacrifice of Christ to the Father. Now, that kind of thing is really remarkable. So, before I talked about how on baptism, you have Baptists and non-denominationals who are really going up against everybody in the early church. Well, this is true for all Protestants or all major Protestant denominations anyway, when it comes to the sacrifice of the Mass. Luther talks about this as the most wide. He said there's no belief in the church more generally received or more firmly held than that the Mass is a good work and a sacrifice. So he knows, this is not just me saying everybody before Luther believed the Mass was a sacrifice. This is Luther saying, yeah, everybody before me thought this was like, this is as widely accepted a view of Christianity as you can have. And then Calvin says the same thing. He claims that the devil blinded almost the whole world into the belief that the Mass was a sacrifice and oblation for obtaining the remission of sins. And the two of them do a really good job of making the case against their own view by pointing out that the texts of the Mass say this, the early church fathers say this, ordinary people say this, theologians say this, like all over the place. You have these comparisons, for instance, between the Mass and the sacrifice of Abel, this perfect offering, the firstborn, all of that is built in. And then you read the church fathers, and they're not only saying that, they're making the scriptural connections to places like Malachi 1, in which Malachi 1, God prophesies that the days are coming when the Gentiles will offer a perfect sacrifice from the rising of the sun to the setting. And he connects this to what he calls the table of the Lord, or the Lord's table. And so the early Christians see this and they're like, well, obviously this is about the Eucharist, that the Gentiles can now offer the true sacrifice to the Father at the table of the Lord. And so, you have this scriptural argument that's being made. It's not just like they blindly assumed this. It's like they're making sophisticated biblical arguments and also saying that this is something that they've received. And this is also not just, again, this is not like one or two people's views. All the Christians knew this for 3/4 of the history of the church. And then suddenly, like, part of Christianity forgot this.
Yeah. Yes. Excellent. And I don't want to sound too much like a broken record, but I'll just ask the audience to consider this. And I know I have many Protestant listeners. Love all of you dearly, right? But just constantly ask yourself on what paradigm is this data better expected, more expected, or better explained, right? Now, again, to be fair, all paradigms have tensions, so maybe you think you have ways of accommodating it, but then we have to think of this sort of cumulative case, our total understanding. So that brings me to my last one, Joe, for now, and I know this could be a topic all itself, and will have to be at some point. But say somebody comes along and says, "Hey, look, I actually got a paradigm that can pretty much accommodate everything you guys have talked about so far. I'm Orthodox, right?" So it seems like we are kind of still in the competitive explanatory race here. All right.
Yeah.
You
And
see where I'm going?
yeah, for sure. And Orthodox are going to track with a lot of the stuff that I said so far. I think when you get into Irenaeus, when he starts talking about the necessity of all bishops to agree with the Bishop of Rome, or the necessity of all people to agree with the Bishop of Rome in 180, that's not some like crazy late medieval pope saying that. That's a French bishop who grew up in the East and lived in the East and then lived in Rome and then lived in the West, who is very clear about this special role of the Bishop of Rome. That special role is not present in Eastern Orthodoxy. That like you might find Orthodox who say, yeah, there's some sort of first among equals or some sort of primacy of honor or something like that, but they just don't account. It's not present within Eastern Orthodoxy. This historic role understood as being inherited from St. Peter, it's just not present. So, and there I would say it probably helps to read Pope Peter with this. I'm just promoting both books now.
Well, let's do that right now. Tell us about this
Yes.
book, where to get it, and then also mention Pope Peter.
Okay,
So they can get the combo.
shop.catholic.com, your local Catholic bookstore, Amazon, like wherever you get good books. If you can't find it, ask for The Early Church Was the Catholic Church. The reason I mentioned Pope Peter, which you can also find at those same places, is that there I look at just the biblical evidence that Peter has a special singular role. At the very start of this episode, we talked about that kind of like triangle-shaped structure that God uses. That whether he's dealing with patriarchs, prophets, judges, kings, whatever it is, there's someone with whom the buck stops. And the East has a respect for this idea. They call it autocephaly, like a self-headship. And the problem is that the buck stops too low, that there's nobody who just holds accountability for the whole church within Orthodoxy. So you have this, like, if someone says they're going to be Orthodox, the next question ought to be, well, which Orthodox? Right now, the Byzantines and the Russians are not in communion with each other, and there's no principle upon which to figure out who's right and who's wrong without just every individual deciding for themselves or basing it off of ethnic considerations or some silly reason like that. That there's an actual principled reason to be Catholic on autocephalous grounds that there isn't to be Byzantine or Russian or something, Byzantine Orthodox or Russian Orthodox. Or the
Yeah. Excellent. Cannot recommend the books highly enough. I'll be sure to link them in the show notes as well. So please, gentle listeners, treat yourself. Get a copy. Get a couple of copies. Make for great gifts as well. Joe, you okay if we take a couple questions from the
I would
gentle
love to
listeners
take.
here?
I love questions.
All right. People, first off, just some comments. People are excited about this great crossover episode.
Oh, nice.
Well, thank you. Yeah, it's
What
always
is this, a crossover episode?
I guess in a way it is, but it's great to have you here, Joe. All right, we have a question from Yate. It says, hello, Joe. My question is, how do I know who's telling the truth in a debate if both are claiming they are reading the church fathers in context, like, for example, on the topic of the Eucharist?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And when we're looking at this, I think there's a few things. One is go back and actually read what they have to say. Two is kind of put it in the broader context. And I try to do this in the book. I look at a few things because the Protestant view is that often the Protestant view is that some people were literalists and some people were symbolic on the Eucharist. And that introduces a conflict in the early church that says there's these two camps, one side that believes the Catholic view of the Eucharist or something like it, one side that believes the Protestant view of the Eucharist or something like it. And if that's true, we should expect to see a fight. We should expect to see these two sides disagreeing with each other and writing against each other. And we don't see that. It's remarkably, none of the early church fathers seem to think that they're disagreeing with anyone else on the question of the Eucharist. So we need a hermeneutic that can explain both the passages that sound symbolic and the passages that sound very literal. in the book, I look at that, and I look at one more dimension, which is the way ancients use the language of symbol. And here we're just misunderstanding them. So here it's just important to know some historical background that a lot of Protestant scholars and exegetes just don't know. That if you're thinking about this from like the background of people steeped in like Platonism or something, symbol and image and all of these representation kind of languages just mean almost the opposite of what they mean to moderns listening to it today.
Great
So I would
point.
just say, if you think about that, like I explain that much more in the book, but the idea is, yes, the Eucharist is a symbol, is a representation, is an embodiment of Christ in the ancient way of describing that. But in saying that, they're not saying the Eucharist isn't Jesus.
Right. Yeah. It's non-competitive there. Right.
Exactly.
And that this actually links to the next question. Alex wants to know, what were the sort of, I guess, philosophical backgrounds of the church fathers before they embraced Catholicism? I know a good amount of them came from a Platonic background, which I think you just mentioned a little bit.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I don't know for all of them. Some of them we just don't know enough about. Some of them were clearly trained in rhetoric. Justin Martyr seems to have had a pretty extensive philosophical background, and he's very well read on Greek and Roman mythology and on philosophy. Others don't seem to have that kind of background. The Epistle of Barnabas, internally anonymous, but pretty clearly just written by a layman who's less informed about things than a lot of his peers. So we can see even within their writings, there's kind of a range of, how well educated they are, how informed they are on Greek philosophy, how informed they are on like the Jewish scriptures, that sort of thing. I know more of the theological than like the rhetorical or philosophical. So I already mentioned the fact that Irenaeus studied under Polycarp. Polycarp was Bishop of Smyrna. He studied under the Apostle John. Though we know those kind of things. The early Christians were much keener to highlight than the question of where they may have learned like rhetoric or the like.
Yeah, very good. Brendan says, what would you say to people who are Catholic who study the councils and say they are obligated not to attend a Novus Ordo Mass? What do you know about this, Joe?
It depends on the reasons why they think they're not, or they're obligated not to attend. It's hard to answer that vague of kind of an objection. I would say that's an ill-informed read of history. But if they can't bring themselves in good conscience to go to a Novus Ordo Mass, they could always become like Byzantine Catholic. And I think at a certain extent, though, it comes down to this: like, if you understand anything about the history of the church, you can trust the Roman See. You can trust that like the Church of Rome isn't this heretical antichrist. It's been one thing that's been very stable throughout 2,000 years. And so people who trust it for the first like 1950 years and then jump ship, there's something kind of irrational about that, I think.
Oh, yeah, definitely. And it's one of those things where, you build sufficient warrant for trust in the magisterium that actually, I mean, it solves so many epistemological problems. Authority does, right? I don't think people understand like how critical authority is to a general epistemology to avoid a sort of even a radical skepticism at some points.
I mean, so just to maybe stress this point, the bar we're talking about here is very low. It's not every liturgical change was a good one or every liturgical change is what I would have done. That doesn't matter. Who cares about that? The question is validity, which is like the lowest bar to clear of like, is this a valid Eucharistic liturgy that done properly is pleasing to God? And it's like, okay, well, yeah, it doesn't matter if like I would have preferred the prayers be somewhere else, and that's not a new thing either. For instance, the sign of peace is probably in the wrong place. No sweat, no big deal. Like maybe it should be between the liturgy of the word and the liturgy of the Eucharist. Before you bring your gifts to the altar, you should, make peace with your brother. That's a good place to bring it right there. Those kinds of things, and Ratzinger makes that point. You can have those kind of questions about these liturgical fine details.
Yeah.
And you're not dealing with validity.
Now this is important because when we're talking about, again, testing a particular paradigm or hypothesis, we do have to try and get clear on what it predicts. And I think it is important for everybody to have some line that you can identify of really to be able to answer how you would know if you're wrong. I think that's important for everybody to do that. So I can say like, look, if there was a Vatican III, right, and the church came out in full authority and said we were wrong about the Trinity, I would have to put my hands up.
Yep.
And I would have to say, I got this one wrong, guys. That falsifies it for me because the Catholic paradigm predicts that will never happen on that level, right?
Exactly.
But that doesn't mean that, but then you have to be very clear about different levels of authority and teaching in the church. So there we're talking about something that's dogma, and the church does promise us that this is infallible, right? It cannot possibly change. So if the church is predicting X there and there's a clear case of not X, I would have to put my hands up and say, I got this one wrong. Fortunately, I don't think that's ever happened. Maybe, Joe, you have a few comments on just any of that in general.
Well, it's a really good point. And like you said, we are dealing with levels of authority there. There's nothing stopping a pope from giving a bad homily, even a homily where he says things that are wrong. It's happened before. Pope John the 22nd suggested that the saints didn't enjoy the beatific vision yet, and the theologians of the University of Paris corrected him, and he quickly retracted the statement, and his successor dogmatically defined the question in their direction to eliminate any confusion. Those kinds of things do happen. That's different than the church dogmatically defining something false. That you can see even in that example. One was a very low level of authority, just an off-the-cuff sort of homily. The other is a solemn act of the magisterium, where there's an actual definition that's occurring. That's an important distinction to make. But once you account for that, the Catholic claim is, very simply, you're never going to be in a situation where you have to break away from the Catholic Church because you have to choose between schism and heresy. And the reason for that is because the Holy Spirit is protecting the church, and ultimately because it would be unjust of God to order you to do one of two sins that he's forbidden you to do. God will never command what he forbids. And so given that, he's not going to put you in an impossible position where you have to guess, is the church committing heresy here? Do I have to break away? Because that's just what we're promised isn't going to happen. Like the whole point of having a visible church, for whom he promises at the Last Supper that the Spirit of truth will lead into the fullness of truth. The whole point of that is that you don't have to constantly second guess that church.
Yeah, that's a brilliant and important and subtle point, that sort of flows again, I think, from a good philosophy of God. God is perfectly rational. He's not going to set up a fundamentally irrational situation like that, right? And I think it also shows that whatever else the gift of infallibility is, and I think you point this out in Pope Peter, Joe, it's not like a gift for the Pope because he's such a pretty person, right? It's a gift for us.
Yeah.
The gift is for us, so we never get put in that impossible situation. I think
it speaks to the goodness of God. If like a loving parent, you're not going to put your kid in a situation where you tell them they're forbidden to do something, and then they find themselves in a situation that you created where the only way out of it is to do the thing you forbade. That would be a cruel kind of hoax. That's not the action of a loving father. And if God's a loving father, he's not doing that to his people. So that's what we trust. It's not papal infallibility is so true, or the infallibility of the church is so true because the Pope is so good or the Catholics are so good. It's because God is good. He's not tricking you and trapping you.
Yeah. All right. Let's take one or two more here. ND Irish says, why are Catholics so ashamed that the church rejected evolution and geocentrism? I think he means heliocentrism here. He does. Yeah, he corrects it. Scientific theories with little to no data, but massive cult appeal. So,
well, I think the idea that heliocentrism has little to no data, I think the fact that either of those have little to no data is something people would hotly debate. And I think also the idea the church rejected them is an oversimplification. We're dealing with a couple things that could take us well beyond probably the scope of time. The condemnation of Galileo, we're looking at an individual court case. We're not dealing with some official church teaching. And there were a lot of reasons. Like Galileo was arguing against Catholic teachings, Catholic interpretation of Scripture based on his scientific claim. There's a whole complicated history of the Galileo affair. With evolution, you read something like Humani Generis, and you can see the outlines of what you can and can't believe about evolution. So we have to believe that Adam and Eve exist in some form. They're not just symbols of broader humanity, but the church is very clear that evolution is an acceptable theory, very clear that the language of the early books of Genesis is mythic language, which isn't to say it's not true, but it's to say that the way it's being told is not being told like a scientific text. All of that you can find, for instance, in the Catechism. So I think the church is trying to avoid overstepping her bounds. if the church dogmatically endorsed evolution or dogmatically rejected evolution, either of those things would be outside of her competency because those aren't theological questions.
Yes.
In as much as they relate to theological questions, the church has an opinion. In as much as they're scientific questions, the church properly leads them in their own realm of competence.
Yeah, excellent reminders there, Joe. Very helpful. Okay, before we wrap up, we mentioned the books. What else are you working on, and where can people keep up with all the stuff that you're doing?
Yeah, Catholic.com is Catholic Answers website. I regularly do stuff there. You can also tune into Catholic Answers Live. I've got my own blog at shamelesspopery.com. I'm going to have 2 new video series upcoming. I'm recording them in February. I don't know when they're coming out. One of them is on images of Mary in the Old Testament, and the other is on the papacy, kind of in line with Pope Peter, kind of looking at a biblical case for the papacy.
Awesome. Can't wait for that. And will give us a good reason to get together again and have another conversation.
Looking forward to that.
So one more time, the early church was the Catholic Church. Please snag a copy or a couple of copies of that, gentle listeners. Really great book. And Pope Peter is the other one. I'll link both in the show notes. Joe Heschmeyer, thank you so much for being here. It's been a blast.
My pleasure. It's been a real joy to be here.